Hello, and welcome to our lecture on new centers of industrial activity. So if you've watched the last couple of lectures that I filmed, you know that we've spent a lot of time talking about the Industrial Revolution and kind of the, for lack of a better term, old school or older areas of industrial activity. So for this one, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the more modern areas and centers of industrial activity. And the slides themselves are designed to accompany the textbook People, Places, and Culture with a few. Actually, I don't think I made any changes to these other than recentering them. But let's go ahead and get started. So one of the first things you got to talk about when you talk about new centers of industrial activity is really the rise of East Asia. We talk about the four Asian tigers of East and Southeast Asia. Those four tigers are South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. Okay. And a few things worth noting. Hong Kong and Singapore, by the way, so Singapore is a city-state, and Hong Kong was essentially a city-state. It was a British protectorate until about 1999. So only within the last 15, 16 years has it really become part of China, and even now it's kind of part of China and kind of not. Okay, and Taiwan, similar kind of concerns. Okay, so 2 out of those 4 really, for lack of a better term, on the fringe of China. Okay, and these tigers really emerged as kind of our first newly industrializing countries. Okay, and Hong Kong ultimately becomes kind of the gateway to mainland China because it's on the coast of China. Okay, and then each one of these in their own way, but especially Singapore and Hong Kong has become much the same as well. They're bustling ports. Hong Kong and Singapore are both major financial centers, and they are break of bulk points. Okay, and Singapore is really famous for being this. But a break of bulk point is where a type of good is transferred from one mode of transportation to another. Okay, so local break of bulk points. The Port of Seattle, where they take the ships off of the containers and they put them on trains and they put them on trucks. Right, Port of Tacoma, same kind of thing. Seattle actually is the second biggest port on the west coast. Seattle or Tacoma, one of the two. Anyways, right? So just important to know, and that break of bulk point idea, that is an important idea that you do need to know, and you do need to know newly industrializing countries. Okay, so the industrial growth of Singapore, and Singapore is kind of an interesting case because it's on Malaysia, but it's not. Or it's on one of the Malaysian islands, but it's not Malaysian. It actually broke away from Malaysia. And its geographical setting is really important when we start to talk about its role as a break of bulk point, because it's partway between China and Europe, and it's close enough to be heavily influenced by both, right? And its role in global economic division of labor is really pretty key when we talk about transferring those a lot of those manufacturing jobs, especially textiles and electronics, over to China, because then they can ship them to Singapore, and from Singapore they can literally go out anywhere in the world. Okay. But all good things must come to an end, right? And in the mid-1990s, and this actually affected all over Asia, but it affected the tigers probably the hardest, right? Was a major collapse in the economies of those 4 major tigers, right? Starting in about 1997, in Thailand, right, lending practices by the government ultimately caused the currency to collapse, which means that inflation went through the roof, right? So their currency was worth nothing, and with that currency collapse ultimately comes a collapse of the stock market, and that spreads outwards from there. Okay, by early 1998, South Korea requires a huge infusion of dollars and help from the United States to help prevent more widespread economic chaos, and ultimately this creates kind of a malaise and creates a little bit of a problem that they're finally now starting to really recover from. China's kind of a special case, though. We do need to spend some time talking about China because in China, what happens, they call it the Chinese juggernaut. Okay? And ultimately, a little bit of history of China, right? So the last emperor of China falls in the early 1900s. There's a period of civil war, really it's almost 30 years of civil war. Ultimately, the communists come out on top in the late 1940s. Okay? And they're dealing with a country that's been absolutely devastated between the Civil War and then also with everything that happened during World War II. And with that, ultimately what they do is they modernize the entire Chinese economy. So the major industrial expansion during China occurs during this modern communist period of really the last roughly 70 years. Okay? And under communist governments, what you see are very strict state planning rules. Okay? And so the government tries to ultimately, especially early in, the Chinese government tries to control every aspect of the economy. It's this type of control, by the way, that leads in the Soviet Union leads to the collapse. But we'll talk about why it doesn't in China in just a minute. So under those state planning rules, what you see is that northeastern district of China, right along the coast, becomes a major industrial heartland. Lots of heavy industries, largely because there's lots of coal and lots of iron. There's also some really major rivers that provide the water you need for processing those things. Okay, and ultimately they become export processing zones, or sorry, not special economic zones is what I'm thinking of. Ultimately they become special economic zones with their own set of rules. Okay. Subsequently, then what we get is the development of the second largest industrial region in China, which is right around the city of Shanghai. Okay. And it's really centered around the country's biggest city of Shanghai. Okay. Because China has a huge labor force of people who, and even till today, some areas of the Chinese countryside are very, very poor, right, are willing to work for less ultimately than people in the West. International countries or companies have variously negotiated with the Chinese government to be able to come in. And what we really see happening is after the death of Mao and after he steps down in the late 1970s, the next premier, the next important one at least, Deng Xiaoping, starts to open up China and starts to liberalize China economically and let go of some of those economic controls. And slowly but surely ever since, the communist government has been loosening up those economic controls and changing its role in the economy. And it's because of that loosening of economic control that the Chinese communists have continued to maintain the control that they have, and that communism in China hasn't collapsed. Arguably, there's lots of arguments to be made about this, but arguably hasn't collapsed in China. So what we've seen is they've gone in similar pattern to other developed countries or developing countries, right? They went from having major heavy, they call it heavy industry, steel and the like, to more of a, they call it light industry, and now they're focused on textiles, electronics, things like that, right? The result is that we've got that far northeast corner has kind of become what we call a rust belt. And a rust belt is just a term that means an area where major heavy industry has left because it just no longer was efficient for them to operate, and they were forced to close down. Okay, we have similar ones here in the U.S., right, in the Northeast. Today, the Chinese government is trying to push industrialization away from the coast, where it has greatly and hugely benefited a lot of people, more into the interior of the country to encourage new investment into those poorer parts of the central and western parts of the country. And one part of the way that they're doing this is they're building up huge infrastructure around transportation and encouraging transportation. They're also, this crazy phenomenon, literally building cities on the if you build it, they will come theory. Right? So this has been a big piece of how China has tried to modernize and tried to encourage development, encourage growth goals in other areas of the country. But China's not the only one to industrialize. So a lot of times we talk about newer industrializing countries, and not all of these are newer, by the way. But you'll hear people refer to what are called the BRICS. Okay? And BRICS is an acronym. It means Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Okay? And these are countries that are show evidence of a shift in global economic power away from that traditional economic core of Western Europe and the United States, right? China is, we talk about just sheer volume. If it's not the largest economy in the world, it's the second largest to the United States, right? India has recently become the world's sixth largest economy, right? But with that, which you have to look at, right? With China, if you look at per capita economic growth, it's not the same. So again, I was talking about just overall, like GDP, GNP kind of numbers. But if you take that number per capita, they go down the list, right? India, similar story. Part of the trick with India is that they don't have any known major oil reserves, so part of what they're doing, part of why even with the size of their economy, so many people are still so poor, is that they have to spend a ton of money on oil for energy, for everything from heating lamps to cars, right, to help power factories and the like. So where are we going from here? Okay, there are geographers who suggest, and really economists who suggest, that a combination of technological changes and developments in the global economy have really reduced the importance of location and made place differences increasingly insignificant. And what that means, in layman's terms, is that it's so cheap to transport things that instead of location mattering, instead of needing to be close to, say, the market or close to the resource, right, or close to the labor force, what companies can do is they can kind of move around to find conditions that suit their best interests, right? So maybe they pay a little more for labor, but they don't have to worry as much about environmental concerns. Or they pay a little more for transportation, but they pay a lot less for labor, right? But really what we need in terms of kind of figuring out where do we go from here is a greater understanding of how places have changed as a result of new production methods, new corporate structures, and new patterns of industry. And that's really an area for future research, and where research is increasingly occurring when we talk about the geography of industrial activity and the geography of industrial location. And it'll be interesting to see what that means for the world as we continue to develop. So this has been our lecture on newly industrializing areas. We talked a lot about China. We talked a lot about Southeast Asia, and looked in particular at Singapore. Right? We also touched a little bit, just a hair, on the BRICS, and talked a little bit about about the role of industrial location, and also what are some future areas for research as we continue to modernize in the world economy. So if you have questions, I would urge you to bring them into class and come ask them, and I'd be delighted to answer them any way I can. And I guess I'll see you the next time we meet.